Welcome to Cash Plays. And now your host, Bart Hanson.
Hello everyone and welcome to another week of Cash Plays. I am Bart Hanson. Today's episode, live at the bike with David Tuckman. Of course, you can email the show at cashplays@pokerroad.com. Send me a Skype over at bart.hanson. You can send a voicemail over at Skype. Or you can send a voicemail over at 877-836-ROAD. Today's episode, I've done the interview actually via Skype with Dave, even though I stayed with him for 5 days last week. Is pretty long. It's over an hour, so I'm going to make this introduction short and quick. Wanted to tell everybody about a new television show that I have on FSN called clubwpt.com. I posted about it over in the Poker Road forums. It is on at 4 o'clock on Sundays. You can check your local listings, and they replay the hell out of it on your local FSN affiliate or Comcast Sportsnet affiliate, which I think they're owned by each other. Comcast owns FSN now. And the first show was on Sunday. You know, I do the voiceover with Barry Tompkins, who's a well-known play-by-play guy over here on the West Coast and nationally for boxing, and he does Pac-10 Game of the Week stuff. And it's a fun show. I mean, all the players are amateur players on the show. The first couple episodes we did last week in voiceover, and again, it airs on Sundays. And I'm just starting to get accustomed to doing kind of voiceover post-production type work as opposed to live poker where you can say, well, it looks like he bets this much. When I say that in tape poker, they say, oh, stop the tape. We want you to say he did bet this much and, you know, all that. But again, the show is basically a bunch of amateurs that have qualified on clubwpt.com, which you can go over there and subscribe, and they have daily and weekly tournaments, and the winners of these daily tournaments get to come out and play in Los Angeles for $5,000. You know, the show is not targeted for the poker fanatic, so I don't want you guys to go over there and think that it's the most amazing poker show ever. It's more targeted for the recreational player that doesn't know that much about poker. But anyways, you know, give it a look. It's my first real into American television now, and FSN has said that if they like what I do over there for poker, then they'll use me for other sports, which is really, really the reason why I got into poker in the first place, through Live at the Bike. Just like this episode is titled Live at the Bike with Dave Tuckman. Interesting. You know, I've always wanted to do sports broadcasting, and it just seemed like a natural fit that when we started doing poker, you know, hopefully I thought that would evolve along to getting picked up somewhere in American television and then using me for other sports. So it's kind of been a goal of mine that's finally been realized, and hopefully everything will go, you know, well. We're slated to do 13 episodes of the show, and hopefully it'll be extended to 40 next year. So with that, we are going to take a little break. I am going to try to get Barry Greenstein on the show for next week's show. If not next week, if I can't catch him before Niagara, maybe the week afterwards. So we're going to take a little break here, and we will be back with David Tuckman. And I want to preface this by the next segment. If people who are not familiar with Live at the Bike or have no interest in hearing the backstory, because I got a lot of emails from people saying, what happened to Live at the Bike? What is David Tuckman up to? Well, this episode will probably answer some of those questions, hopefully all of those questions. And it's the first 15 minutes of the interview. The interview goes for just over an hour, but the first 15 minutes is basically Live at the Bike stuff. So if you're not interested in any Live at the Bike stuff, then you can cut in after the commercials come back 15 minutes. And then we start talking about strategy, and we talk about the $1 Million Cash Game, which is Dave is the lead commentator for, which is England's version of high-stakes poker. And we go over a couple of specific hands that are interesting. One with Phil Ivey and Chris Ferguson. There's another one we go over with Matisow and Ivy, and Dave comments on Durr's play. So it's definitely a very interesting listen to. Again, if you're not interested in the Live the Bike stuff, just click ahead 15 minutes. So with that, we'll take a little break, and we'll be back with David right here on Cash Plays.
Cash Plays. Previously on Poker Road Radio.
Bro, to make $100 grand or $150 grand to travel around, leave your family, and play all these fucking events, and it's not even that, bro. This is I don't give a fuck what anyone says. This is a fucking job. They tell you when the fuck to come, when to leave, when to eat, when to piss. You can't go here. You can't look at your phone. You can't do fucking shit. You're coming to playing from this time. I feel like it's like back to school again, all over again, bro, right? I mean, that's what it fucking is, dude.
Don't miss a moment. Tune in to Poker Road Radio and get all the action from the tournament circuit. Cash Plays.
Welcome back, everyone, to Cash Plays. Live at the bike with David Tuckman. That's what we call this episode. Dave, what's going on, buddy? It's been a long time.
It has been a long time, of course, and although I did get a chance to see you out here, which is great. Too short, though.
Yeah, it's really funny since we're doing this interview over Skype because, we could have easily done it in your living room, which is where I basically stayed. But, of course, that whole passport fiasco happened, and I actually had to come back a day early to do the show that I've been talking about in the first part of the segment, the FSN Club WPT.com show. But tell everybody, I always get like emails and stuff. I get tons of emails. What's Dave up to? What is he doing? You live in London, and tell everybody like what you're up to. What's going on?
Yeah, I moved to London in April, but everybody from Live at the Bike knows that I used to go back and forth to London all the time, and kind of an English homer. But I moved out here for a job. I got my dog out here. Things are good. I'm actually, I cover NASCAR of all things for Sky Sports, and I'm also covering the NFL for Sky Sports. I'm actually doing my first anchoring job this weekend, which is kind of exciting for me.
Well, that's crazy. A lot of people tell like a little bit about like how that works, like because I found it really intriguing.
Oh, okay. Well, for English audiences and a lot of Americans that are displanted out here, what they'll do is they'll bring the American broadcast out here and the American commentators out here. But because American TV is allowed a lot more commercials than English TV, there's a lot of fill time there. So what they'll do is they'll go to studio during American commercials. In England, they'll go to studio. So for about 15 minutes out of an hour show, they're in studio while you guys in America are at commercial, which is where I come in. And basically, I come in, we'll intro the show, we'll do an outro on the show, and then during the 15 minutes while you guys are commercial, we'll do some analysis. So it's a lot of fun. I mean, I'm getting paid to watch TV, watch sport, which is, hey, a guy's best dream.
Well, of course, we always used to, get into sports on Live at the Bike, talk a little NFL. I never really knew that you were that much into NASCAR, but that's interesting.
Yeah, I was never really that much into NASCAR, but, hey, a job presented itself, so I kind of, jumped into it. And, it's always funny, obviously, our director, Isaac, he used to always talk about and always rip NASCAR because he was a big F1 fan. But I will say I've actually really gotten into NASCAR this season. And there's only like 6 races left in a chase. It's actually quite exciting. And,
the part of the reason why you got, or really a big part of the reason why you got over on into English TV was because, basically because of Live at the Bike. We're going to talk about Live at the Bike now. And, we did some work on a television show called LA Poker Scene, which was basically making Live at the Bike into a TV show that was on in England on the UK Poker Channel and on in Canada. And then you developed a relationship and got on over to the $1 Million Cash Game. I'm correct, right? Does that basically?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's a long, drawn-out story that will probably bore your audience. But if anybody has trouble sleeping, they could always listen to this episode. But no, it's just interesting. They always say work begets work, and obviously I have a huge debt to be paid to Live at the Bike. They kind of opened the door for me, and then from Live at the Bike, LA Poker Scene came out. And then LA Poker Scene fed into a show called The Inside Track where, I was fortunate enough to meet my girlfriend. Obviously she is the love of my life right now. And, fantastic. But that led to $1 Million Cash Game, which led to, some other poker jobs out in London, which eventually I met a great director who also, he's in charge of the rugby for Sky Sports. And he kind of introduced me to a guy who produces the NFL. and then that led to the NFL. And then it was the funniest thing was, last year at the Super Bowl when the New York Giants defeated your New England Patriots. I actually sorry about that. I had to throw that in there. But I just sent an email to the producer of the NFL, just like, oh, wow, what a game. I can't wait to come out in September. Looking forward to covering the NFL, bringing it to the English audience. And I said to him, hey, if anything comes up before that, I said, feel free to give me a call. I'm only a flight away, because I was obviously really keen on coming out to England. My girlfriend was out here, and we were trying to figure out how to get together. And he shot me an email back the next day, like, what do you know about motorsports? So, and I kind of figured if I moved out here, some more poker jobs would come about, and they have. I just finished doing the W Coupe, which was cool. I did the highlight show for the W Coupe. Mm-hmm. I did a show for a show called Poker Island, which, probably not the best quality of poker, but, work is work, and it was a pretty good job, actually. And I think that was for 888.com. And, of course, the $1 Million Cash Game just finished up in September. So, but it all started with Live at the Bike, of course, with you.
Well, of course. And, a lot of people, again, they email constant emails into Cash Plays, and they say, well, what happened with Live at the Bike? What happened with Live at the Bike? I mean, to give people a background about what Live at the Bike was Live at the Bike was a webcast that David and I hosted every day from, sometimes we started off for 4 hours and then it went down to 3 hours, which was a live cash game with hole cards. Not lipstick cams, but like camera glass window cards so that we could, constantly see the cards. And we really came about before GSN High Stakes Poker. I don't know if you were in the room, Dave, but I remember when the executives from High Stakes Poker at GSN, or the executives from GSN came in and looked at our setup. And, I don't know if they were planning on possibly doing some business with Live at the Bike, and then they went on to later develop High Stakes Poker, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, Live at the Bike, we kind of, it's funny. I mean, you think about the first online providers out there, like I remember there's like Prodigy and stuff like that, or the people that laid the railroads and stuff. None of those companies made money, but people learned from that and then perfected it. And I think that's kind of what Live at the Bike did, because Live at the Bike really was like a pioneering thing, not to like pat ourselves in the back, but what we did Monday through Friday for 3 hours a night, nobody else did that until now, where everybody seems to do it.
Right, of course. And, and people are like, well, why doesn't it still go on? Why doesn't it still go on? And sometimes I get frustrated by the question because, it's just kind of like I've answered it like 100 times. People just can't believe that there actually wasn't a profitable business model in it. People were like, whoa, isn't the bicycle casino getting, great promotion and advertising? I think that people, especially in poker, in terms of poker business, they way overvalue promotion and advertising. The sites that are making money from whether it's, exposure and advertising have that affiliate model, like a rakeback site or like a site like our friend Shirley Rosario does, where they got in early in the beginning, where you click on a PokerStars banner from their website and you sign up and they have a piece of your rakeback for life. You know what I mean? And people just seem to think that, the bicycle casino was making, tons and tons of money. Live at the Bike wasn't making any money until it went to subscription service, and it still couldn't cover the costs, right?
Yeah, even then it wasn't making money. I mean, once again, not to bore you and bore everybody else, but really quickly, I mean, the bicycle casino, when I talked to the owners of the bicycle casino, and I know you did as well, their business model in a sense was they really felt like there was no point in them advertising more than about 100 miles away from their casino, because they figured that was their audience. Right. And it's hard to argue with that because people that came into town, generally people that came into Southern California for gambling, rather than go to Southern California, they probably would have gone to Vegas. And then often the bicycle casino realized that they could not compete with the Commerce Casino on a grand scale, so they realized that their core audience was about 100 miles radius. So I don't think they saw the marketing potential in Live at the Bike that, maybe you or I did. At the same time, obviously, the internet model, it's such a difficult, model to make money on because you either A, have to charge for your service, which is very difficult because everybody's used to getting things for free on the internet, or two, you have to have so many hits on your site that you can get really good advertising. And when we talk about so many hits, we're talking about,
millions,
we're talking
right?
Hundreds of thousands of hits,
right.
And unique hits and so forth. And I don't want to pretend to be smart enough to know what all that stuff's about. But I do know that we weren't quite getting enough hits to make money on the advertising side of it. And then we went to subscription. And you and I actually both thought that was kind of a a bad idea. Charging for something there was too much poker for free out there. And once you start charging for it, it became a difficult way to really spread.
Well, I think that the problem was that was their original business model in the beginning, that they had planned on charging eventually for it, and they hadn't really I think they maybe thought, well, we'll give it 12 or 18 months and see if we can make money somehow, besides charging for it, and then if we don't, we'll always just go to charging for it. And,
right.
They couldn't really figure out how to make money, and, then they charged for it.
At the end of the day, the world revolves around money. If you can't make money, a business is going to go out of business. The other big problem that had with Live the Bike was its actual association with the bike. Because of their association with the bike, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, because the bike was a casino and they made a lot of money as a brick and mortar casino, they were very concerned with associating themselves with online gaming, especially considering America and especially considering the litigation. On top of that, the bike had an association with the World Poker Tour. And I believe it was an exclusive association where Live at the Bike could not produce anything and put it on TV unless it was World Poker Tour related.
Yeah, that was a big contract. Yeah, that was a big thing that a lot of people didn't understand, the exclusivity deal, that if you were a charter member of the WPT, which the bike was, which Commerce was, Bellagio was, you were not allowed to put any other television of any other poker non-WPT related from your casino. So we were kind of like treading a very thin line when it came to webcasting.
Yeah, no, definitely, and obviously what we did with the LA poker scene in England was probably even towing that line even further. But it really created a difficult spot for us, and it created a really difficult spot for our producers and the investors. And when push came to shove, I think they just didn't see a way for this endeavor to make money. As good an idea as it was, and as great a show as it was, and obviously you and I really enjoyed our time on it. We learned a lot from it. I think we're both headed in the right direction in terms of where we want to go. Definitely in part to that show. At the same time, I just don't know if the money was there for it.
Yeah, and it was still a little bit unfortunate too. And you mentioned online legislation and the ban in America. That actually didn't really come around until really towards the end of what we had. I think that bill was in October of 2006, and we started in January of 2005. So there was definitely some room to kind of foster like a relationship with, I guess, online sites. But again, like what you were saying was that the bike, I think, was really concerned with, they didn't want, say, like a PokerStars or a Full Tilt or, an Absolute Poker on Live at the Bike if they were associated with Live at the Bike, because that might jeopardize their land-based gaming license.
Exactly, and they were going to do nothing to jeopardize that, and I think, lack of foresight on everybody's front, including you and mine. If you and I knew how much money we could have made by just putting a poker site up there and done affiliations like Shirley Rosario did, hey, you and I probably would have done as well, so.
Right, we could have made basically like a Live at the Bike poker website, which was just a skin of some other major site, skin being, basically the same site, but like a different front, a different image, while you're playing on it, kind of like what Empire Poker was to Party Poker. That probably would be the best way.
Yeah, hindsight's 20/20. At the end of the day, did everybody do things a little bit wrong? Probably, but at the end of the day, it was a great show, and it was what it was. Yeah,
and it allowed you and me to basically, get into, now with my FSN gig, you're doing well over in England, get into, television and kind of be known in the poker world. So that's cool. I
think about it right now. It's funny. My girlfriend actually is taking her master's in broadcast journalism, and she's paying, a lot of money to get a master's in broadcast journalism. And it's great for her, and she's very good at what she does. At the same time, you and I kind of had a 2-year apprenticeship where we learned our craft. And if anybody obviously remembers the very first few episodes of Live at the Bike and then goes to the end of it, or hears you on FSN or hears me on $1 Million Cash Game, you can see how far we've come. And it's just funny, we basically got free training and got paid a little bit of money.
Yeah, it was free training. It was also free poker training, too. And I want to kind of, we've talked a lot about this and the business aspect of it, and I want to get down to some of the strategy of poker. And the first thing that, I want to talk to you about, and I don't know how much you've played, recently in the last 12 to 18 months, but, of course I've played a lot, is how much the games have changed since we started getting good with the commentary. And what I mean by that is obviously we're kind of clueless in the first year we were limit props, and we didn't really start playing no limit until the second year of Live at the Bike, which was in early '06. And I think that then we got really good with it. And one of our trademarks, Dave, was betting your hands and fast playing, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think back then it was definitely the way to make money, and I still think against weaker competition, which was prevalent back then, it is the way to make money. But yeah, you talk about how the game has changed. I remember when you and I would first come out of. You usually played before Live at the Bike. I usually played afterwards. But there were nights where it was just so easy to take money down, and make an easy $15,000, $20,000 a month without even really taking any risk.
You didn't really have to be a good player, really, either. It was just about getting maximum value with your big hands, usually.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I mean, I remember one hand in general. I was playing against a drunk guy who lost his first 1,000. He took out 6,000 from his pocket and he threw it on the table. Yeah. And I didn't quite have him covered, but I almost had him covered. I was in the big blind with Jack Deuce, right? The flop comes out Deuce Deuce Ace. Okay.
Right.
I bet he raises. I re-raise. He calls. Okay. On the turn, I push him all in. Which is, he wasn't quite all in. I pushed it in for about $4,100. He calls me. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, in a game today, in one of your games, this guy has to have what? I mean, ace deuce, king deuce, maybe a full house? I mean, what can this guy have?
Right.
I mean, you're just wondering, what would a guy call off his entire stack with there? The guy called off his entire stack with, like, ace with a 5 kicker.
Right.
On a board of ace, deuce, deuce, with the turn was like a jack. You know what I mean?
Right.
And but it wasn't even like, oh my God, he called me, I'm in trouble here. I knew exactly what he had. I was just praying the board didn't come out with the river didn't hit an ace as well. And by the way, like I said, I had like Jack Deuce or 10 Deuce or something like that. And I ended up with a $10,000 pot with nothing.
And nowadays, normally, like the way that I play that, and I've talked about like way ahead, way behind, is I think like if you give that example, like ace deuce deuce, and you have Jack Deuce, you're almost forced in some of the games I play at the 10-20 level. Now, it's different at 5-10 and lower, where usually you're talking about value. But once you start getting up to a level where the players are fairly good and it's fairly big, and even the recreational players are good, I think on a flop like that, you get into a situation where, especially if the guy had open limped in the field, you're either probably way ahead or way behind. And a lot of times I'm checking the turn to keep a consistent line that I would do with one pair and other type of situations, because, if you play the hand like you did now against a halfway competent player, they're never going to commit that much money with ace king. They're really not going to commit a ton of money unless you're probably beat. Now, like if they had like king deuce or something like that, that might be a different story. I mean, it's a tough hand to balance like the spot of trying to get maximum value out of king deuce or queen deuce when you turn a jack, or trying to get like a second street of value against like maybe like ace king or ace queen. Right,
of course. I mean, you got to obviously know the player you're playing against. I mean, another story, obviously, I think you remember this hand. I talked about it on Live at the Bike a long time ago, but it's the same type of hand. I was playing against Stan Goldstein at the Bike, and I think we were playing 5-10 or something like that. But it was an uncapped game, and I was in there with 5-4 in late position, and he was in the blind, and the flop came out like 4-4-7. And he bet really small. I raised really small. And the turn came out an 8. It went check. I checked as well. And then the river, he put out a very, very small value bet. And I almost folded. I ended up calling him down. But, I mean, you're talking about, maybe I lost about $150 on the hands total.
Right.
Because I realized I was like, okay, I'm playing against a good player here. On a board of 4-4-7, I have a hand. I have 5-4. There's really not much I can beat, especially when the turn comes out an 8 because 5-6 gets there.
Right, of course. And it's always an interesting situation too against when you get up into competent games when the flop comes with like two of the same card where obviously you flop open trips. I had a situation at the World Series of Poker when I was playing 25-25 no limit, where I had like limped in like with king 9 on the button, and got limped around like 3 or 4 ways, and the board came out. I want to say it came out like 8-9-9. And this guy bet out of the blind. Everybody folded, and I raised him. And he 3-bet me. Like, he re-raised me. So it was bet raise, re-raise on the 8-9-9 board. I called. The turn was a 10, and now he checked. And alarm bells went off, like, totally in my head. And I checked behind. And the river was an ace and he put out a bet about like a half pot size bet, and I actually folded King 9 because I knew he was the type of player that was conservative enough that he would never bet anything less than a full house there for value at the end with the way that the action came around. Because remember, if he comes out and he bets 7-9 there, and then I call, I raise him, he 3-bets me, and now I call, he has to know I have at least a 9. So if he shuts down on the turn and I check behind, he's never going to try to bluff with 7-9 on the river when the board is 8-9-9-10 ace. So against like competent players, predictable opponents, sometimes players that take lines where they turn their their hand face up, you can fold the hand like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the valuable lesson there is basically if the obvious hand, if your opponent is representing the obvious hand, or you're representing the obvious hand, better said. Let's say there's a flush out there, or there's 2 9s out there, or 2 4s out there, and you're representing that, yet your opponent is still betting into you, and you don't think he's bluffing, you're probably beat. You just got to figure out a way you are beat. You know what I mean? You see you see 3 hearts out there, you're representing the flush, yet your opponent is not scared. Well, then you should be.
Right. Well, that's a pretty good advice. And again, I think it's a really easy example too with open trips when, you've got open trips with a good kicker and somebody's putting heat on you and you don't have a full house and maybe the straight card got there or something like that. You really got to ask yourself, if I'm in his spot, like I said when I used my example with 7-9, I think a good technique is if you put yourself in your opponent's spot with the hand that you can beat in that spot, how would you play that hand? And a lot of times you realize, especially if you're out of position, if you put yourself in your opponent's spot, there's no way that you're betting the river because it's almost like a hand that you're check calling with, you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. I mean, to quote ourselves from Live at the Bike back in the day, I mean, the one thing we used to always say to our viewers, and you can say it now because it's a great tool, is it's just what can you beat? If you're put in a tough spot, start thinking of the hands. What can you beat? And more often than not, you realize that. Wow, King 9, I mean, especially in your case there, you go, King 9 is, would my opponent be betting Jack 9 here?
Right.
And if he bet Jack 9, would it be a really strong bet or would it be more like a blockish bet because he was scared that you had a 9?
Right, something like that. Now, obviously, like, the games online are definitely totally different in the sense of when you're playing 100 big blinds deep and, you're playing 6 max. But most of our talk today is going to be about live play, pretty deep live play, what Simolius talked about back in March where if you're gonna play 200-300 big blinds deep, you've got to figure out how to maneuver pots and maneuver pot sizes and things like that. I just want to give you another example before I move on to another topic too that I thought of this morning. Let's say that you raise the hand out in the field, and a couple people called you out of position. So I'm not even going to give up what you have in your hand, and these are in the 10-20 and up game. These days. And now the board comes out Queen Jack 10, okay? With a 2 suit, or let's say with a rainbow where there isn't a draw out there. And now a guy from early position comes out and bets. And the second guy calls. Let's say it's me, Bart Hanson here in late position, and I've raised pre-flop on the board's Queen Jack 10. You really have to ask yourself, before for maximum value, I would always raise with Ace King. But now I have to really ask myself this, what hands would I really raise with for value there? And it would really only, Dave, probably be a set, middle set or top set or Ace King. And the reason why you go over that in your head is because if you're only raising with those hands, are you really starting to play your hands face up? Because would you ever raise that deep with aces in a spot where a guy leads out and a guy calls in the middle and you've got aces on a Queen Jack 10 board? Would you raise with kings? Both of those hands have marginal draws, and I don't think that you would ever really want to artificially bloat the pot up with overpairs against 2 other people in that spot. So if you're only going to raise with ace king or a set of queens, and your players that you're playing against are at least halfway paying attention, then you become, I think, exploitable to play against.
Yeah, you've got to realize, obviously, if you have kings in that case, or even if you have king, queen in that spot, I mean, that's some people at home might go, well, at least you've got top pair or an overpair with the open-ended straight draw. You've got to realize that there's no way, I mean, if your opponents are somewhat aware of what type of player that you are, they have to think that you might have ace king. At the same time, if they're smooth calling you out of position, they might have ace-king.
Right. And I think the point of what I'm trying to bring up is that, like, in our earlier days, you know, in the games that we saw in Live at the Bike, which could have been up to like 50-100 no limit, I think that you would have lost value by not building a pot up with a nut hand there now. But I think, again, it's kind of twofold, where if you're only raising with your nut hands and you're not raising with aces or kings, and you probably shouldn't be raising with aces or kings there. I mean, nothing's general. That I think to balance your range and keep your hand disguised, then maybe you should be calling with your big hands there as well. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we weren't that far off when we used to do Live at the Bike. I mean, you've got to realize what we used to say, it's in the same vein. I mean, basically, to confuse your opponents, you take a different line that they think you might take. So it's one of those things like, you know, when you're playing against a weak player, they would never expect you to play a flop set or trips hard and fast.
Right, of course.
Which is exactly why we advocated playing it that way, because it was a different line than your opponent thought you might play it. Now, at the same time, you've got to make things look the same way. Now, if you're only betting your sets and you're only betting your made hands, well, then people can always fold. It's easy to know where you're at, which is why you've also got to bet some draws, which is what we used to advocate. Now, in the same sense here, when you talk about this hand here with the 10-Jack-Queen and you're in position, no matter what you have, obviously, unless you've got like pocket fives, you know, it's an easy call spot if you've got a hand that either is a made hand, a big drawing hand, or, you know, a hand that might have some showdown value. You can call there, especially because you're in position. And you're also disguising it because people are going, well, he could be calling with ace-king. He also could be calling with a set of queens. But he could be calling with a hand as weak as ace-queen.
Right, of course. And there was actually, it's funny because a hand like that came out on Poker After Dark Cash Game a couple months ago with Durr against some other guy whose name escapes me, where Durr raised with ace-king and the board came out queen jack 10. And the guy actually had king 9 and led out into him, and Durr just called, and he lost his action when a 9 came, and the guy just check called both streets because he just had a king. But I mean, I think that's like an extreme example, because basically Durr said he didn't raise the flop because he didn't want somebody to, you know, to fold king jack on that board, you know what I mean, or king queen, where a guy might actually get rid of that hand.
Yeah, of course. I mean, with Durr, I mean, and I do have some insight into Durr's play now. I was fortunate enough to watch him for I'd say about 20 or 22 hours of live poker, because he was in the $1 Million Cash Game. Of course, Tom Dwan. You know, when you're such an aggressive player, like Tom Dwan, he might be the exception to the rule, where he might actually be able to get away with a raise with the nuts in that case.
Yeah.
Because he raises with so many hands. I mean, the way I was watching him, I mean, he could be raising in there with 6-7 offsuit on a 10-Jack-Queen board.
Right.
You know, so he's one of the few players that actually might be able to get away with it. But I would say for 95% of the people that play poker, without knowing all the parameters, and obviously it's, you know, the answer in poker is always it depends, but without knowing all the parameters, I would say for 90 to 95% of players out there, a smooth call in that position is never a bad play.
Let's move over to the $1 Million Cash Game, and I'm not sure how comfortable you are talking about specific hands. You know, we can talk about last year's. I know that there was a big pot with Antonius and Phil Ivey, but you're the lead guy with Gary Jones, who's a European pro. So now you get to see these guys. This season's lineup was like Durr, Phil Hellmuth again, and some other full tilt guys. Talk about what went on this season in terms of like the way that the game played.
Yeah, I don't mind talking about it a lot, actually, because I assume that most of your listeners are poker fanatics.
Right.
And I assume if they're listening to this and they hear about a great hand, they're probably going to want to watch the show anyway. Of course, Gary Jones right now is actually a full tilt pro, plays some big games, and I think he plays under, I want to say, Dufool.
Well, he's actually Gary Jones now because he's in red.
He's Gary Jones. He used to be Dufool, and he plays some big PLO games.
Yeah.
I think he won over $1 million last year. But anyway, yeah, he's the color guy. I'm the lead guy. And I will say that I was always trying my best to get you out there, but being an English broadcast, they were loath to have two Americans do the show.
Can you talk about like an interesting hand that happened this season?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there were honestly, Tom Dwan really, you know, he was an absolute coup to have in the show, because he really made for great TV. A couple of little things I'll tell you. I mean, Phil Hellmuth ended up losing over $300,000 and ended up storming out of the $1 Million Cash Game and our cameras caught him walking out, storming out, having one of his, typical Phil Hellmuth temper tantrums. And he stormed off, walked out, jumped into a cab, and presumably got back, took a cab to the airport and left London, which was really funny. I'm trying to think of a couple of really interesting hands. Off the top of my head, I mean, there were so many of them. There was a really interesting hand between Phil Ivey and Chris Ferguson, where there was a strat. We were playing 300, 600. Just for anybody who doesn't know, the $1 Million Cash Game is very similar to high stakes poker. They play 300, 600 blinds with a $100 ante. Now, this hand in particular was a straddled pot, so it was 300, 600, 1200. And I want to say the button was in seat 3 or thereabouts. Phil Ivey was in seat 7. Chris Ferguson was seat 8. We were playing 8-handed at the time. So just giving the lay of the land. So it was 300, 600. There was a straddle to make it 1200. And there was an initial raise, and I want to say the initial raise was probably from Tom Dwan. And I believe the initial raise was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of, $3,500, somewhere in that neighborhood. And don't kill me if I'm off by a couple hundred. Phil Ivey called with deuces. Now, by the way, Tom Dwan, I don't remember exactly what he raised with, but he could have raised with a hand as weak as 6-4 suited. He was doing that, really mixing up his play and getting the best of most of the players. Phil Ivey called with deuces. Another player called as well, actually, between the two of them. And then the action came over to Chris Ferguson, and he had aces. And he made it $26,500 to go, straight. Everybody folded around. Tom Dwan wanted to call because I think he and the entire table knew what Chris Ferguson had, and he figured if he hit his hand, he could break it. But I don't think Tom Dwan was deep enough to call. So he folded his hand. Phil Ivey decided to call this heads up.
Out of position, right?
Out of position. And the flop came out, I believe, and once again, I might be off by a couple, but I know it came out 9 high, and I know there was a deuce out there. So I'm going to say 9-6 deuce. So Ivey hits the set, of course. Ferguson with the aces. Now, relative stacks, by the way, Ivey has Ferguson covered. Ferguson has about $262,000 to start the pot. So he's still got about 235 left, I want to say.
Okay.
Now, Ivey, from watching Ivey, and fortunately enough, I watched Ivey in 06 and 07 in the $1 Million Cash Game. So this is the third time I've been able to see Ivey. So I've actually watched Ivey, fold hands for probably about 40, 50 hours of live poker. And watching what he plays and what he folds is really fascinating. Now, he normally will play his hands very, very fast. I remember earlier in 06 or 07, I want to say, when he flopped the set against Alan Cunningham, he bet right into the razor. He raised it and he played it really, really fast, and Alan Cunningham was able to get away from the aces. In this case, though, he decided to check raise Ferguson. And the way the betting was, I believe the pot was approximately $60,000. Ivey checked to Ferguson. Ferguson bet $40,000. Came back to Ivey, and Ivey made it $100,000 to go. Came back to Ferguson. He thought about it for a while, and I think he thought he was trapping him. I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, I know you had an interview with Chris Ferguson, and hopefully that'll be on later on.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about the hand exactly. But Chris Ferguson decided to call it, which now suddenly the pot has ballooned up to about $250,000, and Chris Ferguson only has about 135 behind. The turn was a nondescript card. Ivey moves all in, and Ferguson pretty much called. I think obviously once he calls the flop, once he calls the check raise, he's going to call the turn. He calls it off. He doesn't improve on the river, and Ivey felts him. Now, Chris Ferguson was playing fantastically throughout the entire $1 Million Cash Game. The entire table was really playing very fast, very aggressively. Ferguson was just playing his game. He was sitting there, and he was really, I want to say he was the big winner at the time, up over 160,000. But in one hand, it all went to Phil Ivey.
Well, I did do an interview with Chris Ferguson at the WSOPE, and that will be on here, maybe next week or in a couple weeks. It's very short, like 10 or 15 minutes long. And actually, Dave, I asked him about that hand, and he did say that he thought he was trapping Ivey for an extra bet. And which leads me into a couple of questions, because literally one of the most common questions I get that comes in from Cash Plays, and the guy, emailed it to me today, and I don't have it in front of me, his name, about how much money you have to have in front of you to call with a pocket pair or suited connector. And we use that 10 times, 20 times rule, like kind of on Live at the Bike, like where, if you and your opponent has 10 times the raise size, you can call with a pocket pair because it's a set or a release. And, you hit a set, what is it, once out of every 8.5 times, 7.5 to 1. But, you allow for some of the times when you hit a set and the guy misses, or you hit a set and he's got kings and an ace comes out. I think it's really interesting to note, though, that when it's really close, like, I'm starting to, like, take the theory that when it's really close, which seemed like in this situation with Ivey and Ferguson, where the guy has just about 10 to 15 times the raise size or the re-raise size. Like, if I'm in Ivey's spot, I look at Ferguson's, it's 26,000 for me to go. Ferguson's got 300,000. Well, it's pretty marginal. But in that situation, I'm almost like more likely to go for it than when, let's say, he's $1 million deep in that spot. Because especially if it's a good player, when he's $1 million deep in that spot, or, 3 times as deep, he's more likely to be able to pot control or do some correct things that don't allow me to extract maximum value. Whereas when he's in that exact spot, that exact 10 to 15 time zone, he just doesn't get away from it, which is exactly what happened to Ferguson in that spot.
Yeah, it's a tough spot, of course, for him. And you pointed out, perfectly there. The one thing that was interesting about this hand, and I don't mind making the call if you're an Ivy spot because of a number of reasons. First of all, it makes you look more of a gambler. I think it helps your image if it looks like, okay, well, I'm willing to gamble it up with something as bad as pocket deuces. Obviously you want to make sure, you want to know that your opponent is going to pay you off. You want to be fairly certain that your opponent has queens or above. If he's the type of guy that'll make this move with tens or jacks, there's a lot of flops that'll come out even if it hits you, but you'll get no action. If your opponent's going to do this with tens, and you have pocket fours, and the flop comes out king, queen, 4, yeah, good luck trying to get any money out of him. At the same time, though, when I looked at this hand, and I was talking to Gary Jones about this, and we didn't get to analyze it properly during the $1 Million Cash Game because, anytime you're doing TV, you get 8 seconds to analyze an 8-minute hand. It comes down to a theory of poker that I like to talk about is when you're playing against a very, very high level of competition, and your opponent also knows that you're also a very, very good player, you're very familiar with each other. When your opponent makes a bet that can't be a bluff, I always question calling with with kind of a questionable hand. Because my thought was, and you and I kind of argued about this as well when we were in London, because I told you about this, Sam, was on the turn, I know he makes the big call on the flop, but my thought is, now the pot is $250,000, he's got $135 behind. And we're not talking $135, we're talking about $135,000. And I know it's all relative to how much they're playing. But at the same time now Ivey moves all in for 135, which in essence is going to give, Chris Ferguson, about almost 3 to 1 on his money.
Right.
Ferguson has to know. Ferguson knows that Ivey knows he has aces or kings. Yet Ivey is still betting. So to me, Ivey's bet there can't be a bluff. It just can't be. I've been racking my brain trying to think of how Ivey's bet there can be a bluff. And if you know Ivey's not bluffing, well, then how do you call with the aces? And I say this with the utmost respect for Chris Ferguson. I've talked to him. I've had lunch with him. He's a great guy, and he's a fantastic poker player, obviously. His record is, notwithstanding. But you've got that hand in particular, I look at it and I think about it, and obviously, I was privy to seeing what was happening, and I just didn't see how Ivey's bet on the turn could have been a bluff. And even if you're getting 3 to 1, if you don't think your opponent is bluffing, well, I don't see how you make that call.
Well, I think it's really it's a very interesting thing that you bring up, because a very advanced player, and because I play so much live no limit, and a lot of these guys, even though they're very, very good players, don't play a lot of live no limit. How often do you get Ferguson or how often do you get Ivey in a no limit cash game? Ivey's usually playing, he's playing mixed games. Now he plays obviously online no limit, but I'm saying like in a live cash game, it's relatively rare. The game that big just doesn't go. And a really, really advanced play, and sometimes if I'm in Ferguson's spot there, if I'm not 100% sure what the guy's going to do, it's kind of what you said. He knows that I know that he knows that I have aces. So if he check raises the flop and I call, I am telling him that I have an overpair. So when he does check raise the flop, I sometimes think I can call and see what he does on the turn, because there's no way in hell he can possibly bluff the turn because he knows that I have an overpair. But in a more advanced line, though, Dave, actually, and something that Ivy could have taken, or sometimes I see at Commerce, is that in that spot where, let's say that you're Ivy and you're against me, and you know that when I call, I have an overpair, and you're possibly thinking that I'm waiting, that I, Bart, am kind of waiting what you're going to do on the turn, that you actually now check the turn from up front and get me to commit.
Right. You're saying Ivy would check there on the turn.
Yeah.
And then Chris Ferguson would kind of think, oh, wow, was he just trying to test me to see where I was at?
Right, exactly.
Put another bet out there. I mean, that was the thing. I mean, I think Chris Ferguson, if he folds on the turn, on the flop, I think that might be too weak of a play. Because if he's always folding aces there, it makes him very susceptible to being bluffed. But I think once he calls, he does tell Ivy what he has, and I think when Ivy does push there, I think he can release. At the same time, I do agree with your play. I mean, in the end of the day, I mean, Ivy got paid off, so he knew what he was doing. But yeah, if Ivy checks that, it's awfully tough for Chris Ferguson to get away from it.
Right. And one of the other things. There are a lot
more interesting hands, by the way. I mean, Tom Dwan. I mean, I can go down a whole bevy of lists. I mean, I don't know if it'll air in the United States. I know it obviously will air out here. I think it's going to be like, I want to say 12-hour shows and 4 2-hour shows or something like that. But I'm sure some of the best hands will be on YouTube, so you can check those out. I mean, really phenomenal. Tom Dwan was very, very impressive. He found himself, he was down really early, playing almost too aggressively against the wrong players, I thought. I mean, I thought he played really, really aggressively against Eli Lesra. And Eli, as everybody knows, is a player who likes to gamble it up and doesn't like it to push out of pots. He certainly doesn't like to fold. And he was gambling it up with him and wasn't getting the best of it. But later on, he was able to win some huge, huge pots. There was a great pot against David Benjamin that I don't remember the details 100% right now, so I don't want to butcher it.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about how and I don't understand why it's really, well, I guess they can't really control the players, but it bothers me as kind of like a poker purist. When they add these straddles and these re-straddles into these big games where the blind structure set at 300, 600, the stacks are relatively deep. Like you said that Ferguson plays 300,000, he was playing 200,000 or 300,000 deep. So he's playing like anywhere from 400 to 500 big blinds deep. And now all of a sudden you add a straddle to 1,200 and a re-straddle to 2,400. So now you're going from playing 400 big blinds deep down to 100 big blinds deep. Or then somebody sleeper straddles it, in some crazy position of 48. It almost seems like it takes away from the skill of the game.
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, I think anytime the blinds are bigger relative to the stacks, I mean, I think it benefits the less skilled players, the players that are more apt to gamble, and I think it hurts the players that like to play post flop.
Right.
Because
having
said that, though, at the same time, I think some of these players at the $1 Million Cash game, per se, they wanted to gamble it up. I think they're used to playing. A lot of these guys are used to playing online. Like Benjamin was there, and Ivy and Antonius, and I think they're used to playing. Multi-tabling a couple of 2 or 3 tables, playing a lot quicker. And I think they might have been a little bit bored. At the same time, you've got to realize, anybody that's familiar with TV realizes that, okay, first off, playing live compared to the internet is going to be slow. Playing TV live is agonizingly slow because you stop and you've got to redo the camera work and you've got to, okay, well, let's redo the deal there. I mean, nothing's posed. It's all authentic, but at the same time, there's a lot of times where the director will stop the play for a minute or two to reset things. So for players that are used to playing 2 or 3 tables at a time online and playing short-handed, playing one live table 8-handed, especially on TV, I don't know if it's enough action for these guys. I think they like to gamble too much.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't remember what specific show it was, but I remember Mattisau actually complaining. Well, let me ask you real quick. Like when you guys were doing tape changes, the game stopped, right? They weren't playing in any types of commercial breaks or anything like that, right?
Yeah, no, and there's no tape change. I mean, that's all kind of factored in. There's just other technical difficulties where somebody walks into a shot and they're like, okay, stop it. There'll be a technical difficulty where, me and Gary were in the commentator's room and one of our monitors went out, so they had to stop it because we couldn't see anything. So somebody had to go in there and fix it. It wasn't a lot of delays, but it's just a matter of, it's the dealer. I mean, for like the World Series of Poker, when you watch that, if you've ever seen it live, the dealer actually has a little mic in his ear where they'll say, okay, deal a flop, pause, 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 okay, turn, pause, make it dramatic, okay, now river, which makes for great TV. But at the same time, if you're playing poker and you want to get into a rhythm, sometimes it can be difficult to get into a rhythm like that.
And I think it was on GSN High Stakes Poker where Mattisau, you talk about if these guys are gamblers or not, or if they're just playing to be on TV. Mattisau was complaining about why they had to stop, during tape changes, during commercial breaks. He wanted to play, not on camera. And the TV guys were like, Mike, we can't really do that because it's going to affect the stack sizes and people are going to kind of want to know what happened in between. You know what I mean?
Right, of course. I mean, the same thing. These guys actually wanted to do prop bets as well, and we couldn't allow prop bets for the same reason. Because we were like, listen, if you're going to do prop bets, you've got to settle it off the table. We don't want $10,000 chips being flying back and forth.
Right.
And it's impossible for us to keep track of who's winning, which, for TV is a big deal, but for poker players, not so much.
I want to go over a couple other things before I let you go. And again, I really appreciate you coming on. Since you've been over in England, have you noticed a different style in terms of no limit hold'em? I'm not exactly sure about PLO or how much experience or how much play you do in PLO. Do you notice any type of difference in the game or how the game is treated, the style of the game over there as compared to when you were over here?
I've been to the Vic about a handful of times and stuff. I will say I play online a lot more now than I ever did when I was back in LA, because LA, obviously, the casinos were just so easily, available. But I've gone to the Vic a couple of times, and I've noticed the games are weaker here than they are in Los Angeles. And I think that's for a reason. I mean, I think, it's a war of attrition when it comes down to, in Los Angeles, I think the bad players will lose. The good players stick around. So, if you start with, 10 bad players and 5 good ones, the 10 bad players go broke or get better,
Right.
I'll put it this way, if you see somebody there who was an awful player a year ago, and you go to the casino and you walk in and you get all excited because he's still there and it's a year later, you have to assume one of two things. Either A, he's got a really good job that pays for his habit, or 2, he's become better, which I know you and I noticed in our own games when we played at the Bicycle Casino. I remember there's a guy that nobody would know this guy's name, but there's a guy we used to play named Maurice, who takes about 9 minutes, by the way, between every decision. Talk about an agonizing player. Oh, hated playing with this guy.
He still plays.
Right, of course, he still plays. And he's a nice guy, but this is a guy that when we first started playing, I would literally froth at the mouth when I would see him at the table. But by the time I stopped playing at the bike, by the time I moved out of Los Angeles, he had improved his game to the point where it was no longer easy money.
No, it's the same thing still now. Like, he's not really a fish in the game.
Right, exactly. And I assume that's generally the rule. You're either going to improve or you've got a lot of money behind you. So it's one of those two things. The play out here, I think, there's other games. People have played PLO and stuff, and I don't think the quality of play out here is quite as good as LA. I think you can do pretty well out here. I know you mentioned that when you were in Foxwoods. You said the games out there were just really good compared to Los Angeles. And I think that's what you'll find. Having said that, I mean, the PLO game was good. I mean, there was a live PLO game, which you don't normally get in LA, which I really enjoyed. I played that a little bit. And I've been playing a lot online, which I do enjoy, and I've been playing a lot of, actually, because of what you said, the no-limit games online, aren't what they were just a couple of years ago. So I've actually been playing a lot of stud high-low.
Right, and you play that, anywhere from like 10, 20 up to 5,100, right? Yeah,
I played actually as high as 100, 200. I'll play as high as 100, 200 if the game is really good. The nice thing about stud high-low as opposed to even no-limit, depending on what level you're playing in no-limit, I noticed when I was playing no-limit at lower levels, there's such a big pool of players. You can take notes on players, yet you'll never find that guy again.
Right.
But the one thing about stud high-low is I take notes on these players, and unfortunately I don't have Stud Tracker. I don't even know if they make it for the Mac. If somebody can tell me that, though, and email Bart, and Bart can tell me, I'd really appreciate that, because I'm looking for some sort of Stud Tracker for the Mac. But anyway, I noticed that the pool of players for stud high-low is much smaller. And I often, when I'll click on the site and play, I'll often find 2, 3, 4 guys in a game that I've taken notes on. So if the game is good, I'll play as high as 100, 200. And I try to play, I don't like to play lower than 15, 30, but if the game is good and it's 10, 20 and I want to play, I'll play it.
Right. And we've actually talked a lot about stud high-low strategy. I've played some 5,100 stud high-low, but mostly online right now. I'm playing Omaha 8, so it's been like a long time. just real basic stuff. What are some of the differences when you move up online in stud high low, like 50, 100? Do you still see guys making like kind of fundamental mistakes, like cold calling, like a 3 to an 8 Raz hand, which is kind of a telltale way of seeing if a guy. I mean, that's how I always think if the guy's good or bad. I don't like to be like pre-flop police, but usually if the guy's in there and he's calling like cold, 2 or 3 bets with 8 deuce 3 offsuit, he's usually the juicy one in the game.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you 2 things. First off, just a little background on our stud high-low play. The Bicycle Casino, where you and I used to prop, it was one of the few places in the world, I think, that had a stud high-low game every single day, 7 days a week. And you and I got a lot of hours in playing. I kind of had a guy, you remember Joe Wynn, of course, who won the 2000 World Series of Poker stud high-low event. He kind of mentored me a little bit and taught me a lot. I read a book called, it's Ray Z's book on stud high-low and Omaha 8 or better. The section on Omaha 8 or better is no good, but the section on stud high-low is very good. So if you want a good book on stud high-low, I recommend the Ray Z book. But anyway, having said that, getting back to the question, I will say the biggest difference, I still see the same mistakes at the higher levels, which is why I play them, but the players are raising with that hand instead of calling. At the 10, 20, and 15, 30, players are calling with 8-3 deuce. They're calling with ace, king, 4. They're calling with pocket 9s. The players at the higher levels are raising and re-raising. So it puts you in a tougher spot because the aggressive play from these players. But at the same time, like any limit game, if you are constantly starting with a better hand than your opponent is starting with, it's very difficult for them to beat you.
Well, one of the things I was actually talking with Joe Tall from Deuces Cracked over the phone yesterday, and he was telling me about the structure of the PokerStars stud high-low game was that the ante structure was so bad that just knitted play basically was rewarded. I mean, are you paying attention? You must be paying attention to the ante structure on Full Tilt in terms of – because, I mean, the ante in ratio to the bring-in and ratio to, like, the first bet can dictate how loose or how tight you play, right?
Well, of course. I mean, that's exactly what – I mean – every poker game you start with, every poker game you play, it's a battle for the blinds or a battle for the antes. If the antes are so small relative to the bet sizes, well, obviously you can play it really, really nitty. There's no point to mix it up. Obviously, if the antes and the bring-in is very high relative to the bet sizes, to the limits, well, then the opposite takes place. You're going to have to play it a little bit more aggressively. The sites I play on, I mean, I think they're pretty standard though. It's, if I play 20-40, I believe the ante is 3, I want to say the bring in is 6. So it's a pretty standard play. I think the big thing with stud high-low that a lot of people make mistakes on is 5th Street play, which, I think a lot of people make a mistake on 3rd Street, but I think a huge mistake is 5th Street, which is where a lot of players, because once you make that mistake on 5th Street, because you obviously get the 3 big bets in stud games, as opposed to, no limit games or any hold'em games where you only have 2 big bets. The stud games where you have the 3 big bets, if you make that mistake on 5th Street, oftentimes that'll beget another mistake on 6th Street, and then before you know it, you start looking at the pot size, and you end up talking yourself into making a bad call on 7th Street, and then you realize you've lost a lot of money on a hand that you probably could have gotten out of on 5th Street.
One other quick thing, too, we actually talked about this a little bit when I was in London, is about how the really good stud high-low players can identify when their opponent, when heads up, might have a busted low and are willing to call them down with any pair or ace-king high, and because of that, might bet their busted low when they run into like a pair of 9s or a single pair of 10s on 7.
I'm sorry, say that one more time. You got a little fuzzy there.
I was going to say that the really good stud high-low players, when they're heads up against an opponent, they really find the thin value bets with high hands when they identify that their opponent might have busted out like on low with their low draw on 7 and might call them with a hand as weak as ace-king high. And they've also busted out, and they'll bet like a hand as weak as like a single pair of 9s on 7th Street.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that at all. I mean, especially if your hand is disguised. I mean, you've got to realize any limit game, value betting is huge, no limit, obviously, if you make a thin value bet, you're reopening the raise to your opponent, and you're reopening the betting to your opponent, and he could bluff you out. Oh, by the way, that was another interesting hand on $1 Million Cash Game I'd love to touch on. But having said one last thing, though, in terms of stud high-low, because your opponent will be going for low and back into a pair of sixes or a pair of fives. If you back into a pair of nines or a pair of tens, it's an easy bet situation because you will get called, especially if you're representing low, because your opponent will just hope for half the pot, because then he'll be looking at it going, well, I'm getting 9 or 10 to 1 on my money or 6 to 1 on my money. I should call this because my opponent would be betting a low even if he has no high.
Right.
So that thin value bet is huge.
And of course, I mean, probably at the level that you play at, you don't see this value bet miss that much, but always at the 20-40 game of the bike, if you're going low and you run into too low pair and a guy is basically announced that, like, say he raised with a jack up and he's got, he's got split jacks, something like that, and you run into too low pair on 7, you should almost always value bet because he's always going to call you with one pair. Now, sometimes you might lose because he was running into jacks up, but you only have to be good half the time, right, when you bet and are called.
Yeah, and even more so, if you're playing against a good opponent, not only will he call you with jacks, but if you check to him, he's going to bet jacks up. Okay? And you're going to be forced to call him with 2 pair.
Right.
So you might as well bet it. It's one of those times where you don't want it. Basically, if you check it there, well, you're going to lose the value when he only has jacks, and you're probably going to end up paying him off when he's made jacks up. Because a good player will always bet the jacks up there when you check to him, because he's going to hope that you back into 2 pair as well, 2 small pair.
Right.
Can I touch on this $1 Million Cash Game hand?
Sure.
Because it was so interesting. I just remembered it was a hand between Mattisau and Phil Ivey, and Mattisau had 2 kings, one of them being the king of clubs, and Ivey's hand is completely it doesn't make a difference what he had. But basically, the way the betting went, it went into the river, and on the river, a 4th flush card came out. So. Plus the board was paired. I want to say there's a pair of 9s on the board plus 4 clubs. And on the river, Ivey checks to. Now Ivey never did any betting. I believe he made a pair on the flop or something. He checked to Mattisau. Mattisau bet. Ivey took one off. Then the turn betting, Ivey checked. Mattisau checked. The river came the 4th club. I think the turn was the board pairing. On the river, the 4th club comes out. Ivey checks it and really looked like he had just given up on the pot. It's like, okay, well, I can't win this pot. Well, I'll probably just check and fold. But then Mattisau bet, and it was a great read from Ivey because he thought it was somewhat of a thin value bet here. And he kind of punished Mattisau. I also thought that Mattisau, the money might mean more to Mattisau than it means to Ivey. And I think Ivey knew that. And he took advantage of this fact because he then check raised him on the river. Now, Ivey showed no strength on the flop, on the turn, and he checked the river, but he check raises Mattisau when he puts the thin value bet in there. And with a paired board and 4 flush cards out there, even though Mattisau had the king of clubs, he ended up laying down the 2 kings. And Ivey took it down which amounted to absolutely nothing. It was a fantastic bluff. And I believe, actually I want to say exactly, I think Ivey had ace 4. So, and the board was blank, blank 4. And he showed him the ace of spades on the river.
Well, of course, I mean, Mattisau might actually only be on 1 bullet sometimes, in those types of games too. You know what I mean? He's got a backing and he's got 1 bullet.
Right, exactly. I just think the money meant a little bit more to Mattisau. Mattisau, by the way, had a nice showing and ended up winning about $100,000. But it was clear the money meant more to him than it did to, say, Benjamin or Ivey or Patrick Antonius.
Well, it sounds like it was definitely an interesting season, and you can check it out when in Europe when it comes out. And again, if you're a fanatic over here, there are certain sites that you can pick it up on. I want to ask you one last question, Dave, before I let you go.
Shoot away.
Because we've talked about this. I got into this 3 or 4 episodes ago, and I think you're the perfect person to ask this question because I think you do it so well. I've tended to criticize a lot of young kids, a lot of online players, when they come in and they play live, okay? They don't foster the type of environment that makes it enjoyable for other recreational players that play at the table. They just sit there with their headphones, with their baseball caps. They say nothing, they grump, they moan, whatever. They might be good players, but they're just stumps basically at the table. They say nothing. Now, you were a guy that actually used great table image and great gambling feel. I remember you would play with a backwards cap on at the table, and you would really jaw it up with some of the guys. Tell us about how you developed that and how that helped your game.
Well, I mean, I think started off. I mean, first of all, by the way, I listened to your episode with Gabe Thaler, and if anybody's missed that one, they should really listen to that. Gabe Thaler, good friend of mine and a great player, and he talked about this as well. First off, I play poker to have fun. Yeah, I wanted to make money, and as I developed as a player, I realized, okay, wow, I can make a living doing this. But when I played as a kid, when I played in high school, I watched my dad playing, and then I played through high school. I played for fun. Well, playing for fun, I'm going to talk to my friends, and I'm going to socialize. So, I mean, it started just with that. Now, when I started making a living doing it, and when you and I started propping, I realized I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this for 40 hours a week, I don't want to sit here and just like listen to my iPod for 40 hours a week. You know what I mean? There are times where, I want to be quiet and not talk to people, but just being a social person, it just makes it a lot more of a fun environment. Now, if you want to play against players if you want to play against other professional players and everybody have iPods on, hey, it's great. But if you want to play against players that are recreational players that are only coming out, say, once a week or twice a week, and it's their poker night and they're having fun, well, they want to have fun. And if you don't create a fun environment for them, they won't come back. Because you've got to think about it. I mean, you and I, we played against so many recreational players. Why do they come? They come because they have a good time. I mean, we can come up with a million reasons why a recreational player plays. Is he divorced? Does he not have a lot of friends? Is this where he gets his camaraderie? Is he, is he just a night away from the family? Is he married and he can't stand his wife and he wants to get away? Whatever it is, he comes to the casino to play poker to have a good time.
Right. And I definitely think that the whole concept is lost on some.
It's completely. I mean, you've got to realize. I remember talking to some professional players about this, and they actually said, they go, you know what? I almost consider myself an entertainer. If somebody comes in, he's like, I'm there to entertain them. He's like, and if somebody's going to lose a couple $100 or a couple $1,000 or whatever stakes you're playing, obviously nobody wants to lose money. They all want to win. And and the worst player in the world is going to win sometimes and he's going to lose sometimes, especially if you're playing Hold'em or PLO, say, which is even more of a crapshoot.
Right.
But in the long run, they will lose money. And more often than not, they don't mind that they lose money. They expect to lose money. But they also expect to have a good time. And I'm not saying that you've got to be the guy's best friend. But if you want that bad player to continue coming into the casino, you have to make it a good environment. Now, like I said, I mean, it might not be in your personality. My personality is to be very social. I'll put a hat on backwards. I'll have fun. I'll joe with people. And you know what? I'll try to make it as fun as possible for myself and for everybody else. And sometimes I'll probably offend people. I've been known to do that once in a while. I haven't offended you, of course. But having said that, it's one of those things where, you want to make the environment somewhat friendly. So if a guy gives you a bad beat on a play that's so ridiculously awful, before you just completely destroy him and make him feel like a piece of crap, think about it for a second. Just think, how is this going to help the game? All I can emphasize, if you haven't listened to the episode that you did with Gabe Thaler, he had a great story, and there's no point in me in harping on this, but just go listen to that story, and Gabe Thaler hit it right on the head, and this is a guy who's made a living playing cash game poker for the last 10, 15 years.
Right. And that was, of course that was back like a couple months ago, and, just basically saying, that you shouldn't get mad at a recreational player for sucking out on you. It's basically the moral of that story.
That's what you want him to do. I always laugh when somebody goes, there's two things I can always say to people, and I'll even say it sometimes. I'll even try to defend the recreational player. Number one, as long as I'm putting my chips in, or as long as the recreational player is putting their own money in, well, you know what? I'm going to make my own decision, okay? Until you start backing me, don't tell me how to play. Second of all, do you really want me to play optimal poker? Do you really want me to play the way you think I should play? Because if I play that way, you have no edge over me. You want me to call a raise. You want me to call a ridiculously sized raise with a hand like Queen Jack suited. Because I'm not playing properly, and in the long run I will lose. Yeah, once in a while I'm going to flop Jack Jack Deuce against your aces, and you're going to be committed. And you're going to stack off against me. But that's what you want. And the few times that it actually works for me will reinforce that bad play.
Dave, I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a long interview. Thanks for all that insight with Live at the Bike and the $1 Million Cash Game. And, hey, I wish you luck with NASCAR. I know that you did an NFL broadcast last night for Monday Night Football. How did that go?
That was good. That was cool, actually. I did it with an offensive lineman, a former offensive lineman, Ian Allen, and everything. We did the Minnesota-New Orleans game last night. And kind of a strange game, of course. I mean, Reggie Bush had two punt returns for a touchdown, and it was just back and forth. It was a weird game, nothing like we thought it would be. But I'm looking forward to next week, actually. I'm doing next Sunday night, I'm anchoring I've got the San Diego-New England game, which should be a great game, so I'm really looking forward to that.
I'm actually going to that game, Dave, I'm pretty sure.
Are you? Okay, well, you're going to it.
Yeah.
I'm going to be broadcasting it, so it'll be a good time, and I don't know, man. I think the Jets are poised for the Super Bowl this year. Wide open AFC.
The Jets, oh boy. Yeah, I can't believe that Buffalo lost this week, too, you know? And look at Miami.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
You and I, we could do a whole nother podcast just on football.
Wow. Don't, you stick that idea in your head, it might come true at some point. Yeah. All right, that's going to wrap it up this week. We will see you next week. There's a fairly good chance that Barry Greenstein might be on next week, if not the week afterwards. So see you next time right here on Cash Plays.